The marriage contract. Emily Carter agreed to a fake marriage with Alexander Reed to save her sister, but she never expected her heart to get caught up in real love. When the contract expires, will she walk away, or will love bind them together forever? If you enjoy this content, don't forget to like, share it with your friends and family, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories. Emily Carter stood behind the counter of a small cafe on Lexington Street, absent-mindedly gazing out the large window. Outside, the early spring breeze rustled the tree branches while the street lights cast soft golden hues onto the sidewalk. Inside, the hum of the espresso machine filled the air, blending with the rich aroma of coffee and the sweet scent of freshly baked pastries. At 24, Emily once dreamed of more than just standing behind a counter wearing an apron and serving coffee to hurried customers. She had graduated with a business administration degree from an average university, hoping to land a stable office job. However, reality was far more unforgiving. A year had passed, and she still hadn't found the right job, barely making ends meet with her modest paycheck from the cafe. But that wasn't even the worst part. As the end of shift chime rang, Emily took off her apron and left the cafe, walking down the dimly lit street. She clutched her thin coat tightly against the biting night wind. Instead of heading straight to her small apartment, she turned toward St. Mercy Hospital, where her only family, her sister Linda Carter, lay in a hospital bed battling a ruthless illness. Linda had always been strong and independent, the pillar of support for Emily ever since their parents died in a car accident when Emily was just 15. But now Linda was the one who needed protection. Diagnosed with a rare heart condition that required urgent surgery costing $200,000, Linda's life was at risk. Emily had tried everything to gather the money. She applied for a loan, reached out to old acquaintances and college friends, and sought higher-paying jobs, but nothing worked. Every opportunity required experience she didn't have, and every night, desperation seeped into every part of her existence. That day, as Emily arrived at the cafe, her heart felt heavier than ever. Linda had been rushed to the hospital the night before due to a severe heart attack. The doctor warned that surgery could no longer be delayed, and the pressure weighed on Emily, making each step feel like she was sinking into quicksand. Distracted by her worries, she returned to the hospital after her shift. Fate, however, had other plans. As Emily carried a tray of coffee to a table, her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and stress. Not paying attention to her steps, she stumbled, and in a split second, the cup tipped over. Dark liquid spilled onto the pristine white shirt of the man in the expensive suit, and the cafe fell silent. Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. What had she just done? Panic surged through her as she looked up and met the man's piercing gaze. His expression darkened, and his stormy gray-blue eyes turned ice-cold. This was Alexander Reed, young, wealthy, and notorious for his ruthless demeanor in the business world. Emily had no idea that this single moment would change her life forever. Alexander set his cup down, his cold gaze flickering to the coffee stain spreading across his crisp white shirt. Silence enveloped the cafe as every employee held their breath, waiting for his reaction. Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide with dread. She knew she had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't an ordinary customer. He was not the kind of man to simply brush things off with a laugh. Alexander Reed, CEO of Reed Corporation, was a name known throughout the business world. By 30, he had built a billion-dollar financial empire, leading high-stakes deals across the globe. Known as a financial genius and a man who never let emotions interfere with business, he was, in many ways, dangerous. Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she grabbed napkins from a nearby table. "I'm really sorry," she stammered, hastily trying to dab at the stain. Before she could touch him, Alexander caught her wrist with a grip as firm as a blade. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice deep and commanding. Emily flinched, immediately pulling her hand back. "I'll take responsibility. I'll pay for dry cleaning or buy you a new shirt," she blurted out in panic. But as soon as the words left her lips, reality hit. There was no way she could afford to replace his designer shirt, worth more than her entire year's salary. Alexander studied her for a moment. Although he didn't have time for trivial matters, when his gaze settled on the petite woman trembling before him, he found himself unable to look away. Her brown eyes, though filled with fear, held an underlying resilience, shadowed by deep sorrow. Instead of demanding compensation or scolding her, he simply asked, "What's your name?" Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Emily Carter," she replied after a brief pause. Alexander stood up. "All right, Emily Carter, you can keep your apology. I don't need it." Without another word, he left the cafe, leaving Emily frozen in shock. Later, Alexander returned to his office on the top floor of Reed Corporation, a luxurious yet cold space reminiscent of its owner. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the dazzling New York City skyline, a lifeless jungle of concrete and glass in his eyes. Barely settled into his chair when the landline phone rang. "Alexander, your mother wants to speak with you," his secretary informed him. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He already knew what this call was about. A moment later, the soft yet firm voice of Evelyn Reed came through. "Alexander, how much longer do you plan to continue like this?" "What exactly are you referring to?" he asked evenly. "You know very well what I mean," she replied sharply. "You're 30 and still unmarried. The board has started questioning the future of the company. If you don't settle down soon, they will lose confidence in your ability to lead long-term." Alexander clenched his jaw. He knew all too well about the ridiculous tradition. Reed Corporation was a legacy of generations, but as a family-run empire, it came with outdated customs. One of these was that the heir must be married by the age of 31 to ensure corporate stability. If he failed to meet this requirement within the next 6 months, control of the company would be handed over to his uncle, a man considered more qualified simply because he had a perfect family. Alexander didn't believe in marriage. Once, he had believed in love, but after being betrayed, he trusted only in business transactions, things he could control. Now, if he didn't marry soon, he would lose everything he had worked for. Later that day, as Alexander stopped by his usual cafe for his morning coffee, he overheard muffled, desperate sobs from the employee break room. Please let me borrow the money. I'll do anything to pay it back. Just give me a chance." Frowning, Alexander peered through a small gap in the door and saw Emily standing in the corner, clutching her phone tightly, tears streaming down her face. She looked exhausted, her small shoulders trembling. "My sister is dying. I can't lose her. I'm begging you," Emily whispered into the phone. Her plea was met with a cold, dismissive rejection from the other end. For a moment, Alexander remained silent. He wasn't the type to meddle in other people's problems, but as he observed her, he realized that Emily wasn't like the desperate people who often came to him. She wasn't pleading out of greed, she was doing it for her family. An idea formed in his mind, a marriage contract. She needed money, and he needed a wife to satisfy his family. For the first time in his life, Alexander Reed decided to break one of his own rules. He would make her an offer she couldn't refuse. Emily pulled her small suitcase into Alexander's grand mansion, feeling overwhelmed and uneasy. She had never set foot in a place so opulent. Everything from the towering walls and spiral staircase to the glittering crystal chandeliers made her feel like she had stepped onto a movie set. "You don't belong here," she thought. Alexander led her into the living room where the housekeeper had already prepared water and a stack of documents. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "From today onward, you'll live here. In front of my family and the media, you will play the role of a perfect wife. No exceptions." Emily nodded, still struggling to process the reality of the situation. "We won't interfere in each other's personal lives," Alexander continued. "You're free to do whatever you want as long as you don't let anyone find out that this is just a contract marriage. I don't like unnecessary drama." Emily bit her lip. Everything was clear and straightforward, devoid of any emotion. But in the end, the money he was offering would save her sister's life. "All right," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Alexander gave a curt nod. "Good. The housekeeper will show you to your room. I have a meeting to attend." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing alone in the vast house, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Over the next few days, Emily realized that living with Alexander was far more challenging than she had expected. He was excessively controlling, demanding that everything be in perfect order, while she was used to a simple, relaxed way of life. On her first morning in the mansion, she woke up later than planned. When she finally made her way to the dining room, Alexander was already seated, immaculately dressed in his tailored suit and reading the newspaper. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily blinked. "I thought I could wake up whenever I wanted." "Not when you're supposed to be playing my wife," he replied. Alexander's tone was icy. "My family pays close attention to appearances. If you show up late to breakfast looking like that, they'll start asking questions." Emily huffed, knowing he was right. Their clashing over countless little things continued throughout the day. She liked leaving things scattered around while he insisted on absolute tidiness. She enjoyed fast food while he only dined on meticulously prepared meals by his private chef. She wanted to watch movies in the evening, but he demanded silence so he could work. Two completely different worlds had collided, and neither of them was prepared for what was to come. "Are you even human?" Emily grumbled as Alexander reprimanded her for chewing gum in the house. "Are you sure you're an adult?" he shot back, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Neither was willing to back down, and their daily squabbles continued. One afternoon, while wandering around the pool area, Emily accidentally tripped on the steps and lost her balance. In a panic, she reached for the nearest thing to steady herself, Alexander's phone. With a splash, the phone fell into the pool. Emily froze. Had she just dropped the CEO's phone into the water? Frantically, she crouched down to retrieve it, but it was too late. Just then, Alexander stepped out of his office and took in the scene. His voice dropped to a dangerously low tone. "What did you just do?" Emily offered a sheepish smile, holding up the dripping wet phone. "It was an accident," she managed to say. Alexander inhaled deeply, trying to contain his irritation. "That phone was for important business calls," he said, his voice measured. "Now my entire schedule, documents, meetings, all gone." Emily swallowed hard. I can buy you a new one," she offered timidly. Alexander let out a humorless chuckle. "Do you think a new phone can fix everything?" In that moment, Alexander realized something unexpected. Emily had not acted out of greed, she was simply a clumsy girl trying to navigate a world she didn't belong in. Despite his cold exterior, he found her oddly adorable. As time passed, Alexander gradually realized that Emily was not as greedy as he had initially assumed. She never asked for expensive clothes or jewelry, nor did she demand lavish dinners or diamond rings. She lived simply, cooked her own meals, and even helped the mansion staff with cleaning. One night, while working late, Alexander heard noise coming from the kitchen. When he walked in, he found Emily sitting at the table with a small notebook, her eyes red and puffy. "What are you doing?" he asked. Startled, Emily quickly wiped her tears. "Nothing, just calculating my sister's hospital bills," she replied. For the first time, Alexander saw that she wasn't pretending. She wasn't a gold digger after wealth, she was a devoted sister desperate to save her sibling. For a man who believed that everything in life was a transaction, this shook him to his core. Since moving into Alexander's mansion, Emily had slowly adjusted to life there. Despite their frequent clashes, she began to see that Alexander wasn't as heartless as she had thought. It became evident when her sister was hospitalized for surgery. While Emily had expected to handle everything alone, she was stunned to see Alexander already at the hospital, dressed in a sharp dark suit. He stood beside her sister's bed, discussing her condition with the doctor in his usual calm manner. Why are you here? Emily asked in shock. Alexander turned to her, his expression unreadable. Did you think I'd just throw money at the problem and walk away? He replied. In the following days, he continued to surprise her. One chilly evening, as she sat in the garden shivering from the cold, a warm coat was suddenly draped over her shoulders. Don't get sick, Alexander muttered before walking away without another word. Emily remained seated, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. Though he never said it outright, she began to realize that he cared for her in his own way. One day, Emily received a text from Ethan, a former co-worker from the cafe who had always shown interest in her. Although she had never considered dating him, their meeting at a diner near the hospital was abruptly interrupted when Alexander suddenly appeared. Before Emily could react, Alexander was standing beside her, his icy gaze fixed on Ethan. She's my wife, Alexander declared in a deep, authoritative tone. Ethan's eyes widened in shock while Emily turned to Alexander in disbelief. Your wife? Ethan stammered. We're married, Alexander repeated, his sharp eyes daring Ethan to question it. Emily had never seen him act like this before. He was usually composed and in control, but now there was an unmistakable edge of possessiveness in his tone. Later, on their way back, Emily tried to tease him. You didn't have to react so strongly to Ethan. Alexander kept his eyes on the road, his voice calm yet slightly annoyed. I don't like other men touching what's mine, he replied. Emily's heart pounded, and despite the tension, she couldn't deny the warmth creeping into her chest. Over time, Emily began to wonder why Alexander despised commitment so much. He didn't believe in love, only transactions. Her curiosity led her to an unexpected discovery. One night in the mansion's library, she found Alexander sitting alone with a glass of whiskey, his eyes distant. Are you okay? She asked softly. After a long moment of silence, his voice came out low and rough. Do you know why I don't believe in love? He asked. Emily shook her head. He let out a bitter chuckle, adding, I once had a fiancée. I loved her, and I thought she loved me too. But then I found out she was only with me for the money. The day I proposed, she ran away with her lover, taking a large sum from my company. Emily froze in shock. Alexander took a deep breath, his voice lowering further. That was when I realized that love is just an exchange. Without money, no one stays. A deep heaviness settled in Emily's heart. She had always thought Alexander was just a cold, emotionless man who didn't know how to love. But now she saw that he had loved once and was hurt too deeply to trust again. That realization broke her heart more than anything else. From that moment on, Emily began to see Alexander in a different light. She noticed that behind his tough exterior was a man who had been deeply wounded, someone protecting himself from emotions he didn't want to face. And slowly, Alexander began to change. He no longer saw Emily as just a part of a contract. He noticed her, protected her, and worried about her. One night after working late at the hospital, Emily fell asleep on a chair in the waiting area. Alexander found her. Without a word, he draped his coat over her shoulders and sat beside her, silently watching her sleep. For the first time in years, his heart began to tremble, but he couldn't admit it. If he did, he would lose control. Time passed faster than Emily had expected. When she first agreed to the marriage contract, a year felt like an eternity. But now, with less than a week left before the contract expired, she dreaded the moment she had to leave. Emily had fallen in love with Alexander. She had known it for a while, from the moments he silently cared for her, from the times he stood up for her in front of others, and from the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Yet he had never said he loved her. Everything between them had started as an agreement. When the contract expired, she would have no reason to stay. One evening, Emily stood on the balcony, gazing at the dazzling city lights. Alexander approached from behind. What are you thinking about? He asked. She smiled, masking the ache in her heart. Just that this year went by so fast. Alexander remained silent for a long time before asking, "Do you have any plans after you leave?" Emily clenched her fists. "I'll find a stable job. My life will go back to normal." Her words stung. She didn't want to leave Alexander, but she couldn't stay when she was the only one in love. Looking up at him, she saw that he was still the same cold, proud man she had met a year ago. If he had no intention of keeping her by his side, she wouldn't beg for his love. Her decision was made. She would leave the next morning. That night, Emily quietly packed her things. Before she left, she did something no one expected. She returned the entire $500,000 that Alexander had given her and left behind a short letter with only one sentence: "I never stayed for the money. I stayed for you." When Alexander walked into the room and saw the stack of money on the table along with the note, his entire world shattered. He picked up the letter, reading the words over and over. Emily hadn't taken a single cent. She had never cared about money. She had only cared about him. At that moment, Alexander realized he had made a terrible mistake. He rushed out of the mansion, his heart pounding. "Where is she?" he demanded of his driver. "Where is Emily?" The driver replied, "She's at the airport." Alexander had never felt fear like this before. He had lost Emily once because of his own stubbornness and pride, and he wouldn't lose her again. The car sped down the road, running red lights and breaking every rule. Nothing mattered except getting to Emily in time. When he arrived at the airport, he practically jumped out of the car. His frantic gaze scanned the crowd until he saw her. Emily stood near the security checkpoint, a small suitcase beside her. Without thinking, Alexander ran toward her. "Emily," he called out. She froze and turned around, gasping as she saw him standing there, out of breath and with eyes filled with emotions she had never seen before. "Don't go," Alexander pleaded in a rough, almost desperate voice. Emily's heart trembled as she looked at him. "But the contract is over," she whispered. Alexander tightened his grip on her hand. "Forget the contract. I don't need a contract. I need you." His eyes widened with sincerity. Finally, summoning all his courage, he said, "I love you, Emily." For a long moment, Emily stood frozen, waiting for him to say it again. "I love you," he repeated, as if afraid she wouldn't believe him. "Not because of a deal, not because of any condition, but simply because you are you." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as Alexander squeezed her hand. Then, right there in the middle of the airport, he dropped to one knee and pulled out a sparkling ring. "The first time I proposed, it was with a contract," he said, his voice deep and warm. "This time, I'm proposing because I want to spend forever with you." Overwhelmed, Emily burst into tears. She didn't need to think anymore. She loved him, and he loved her. With a trembling nod, she said yes. In that moment, all past disagreements and contractual obligations melted away. Alexander and Emily got married again, no contracts, no conditions, only real, genuine love. Emily's sister fully recovered after her surgery, and when she saw the way Alexander cared for her sister with so much love, she simply smiled and said, "You found the right man." Emily was no longer just a struggling cafe waitress, and Alexander was no longer a cold-hearted CEO. They were just two people who had fallen in love, and this time, they would be together forever. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. If you enjoy this content, please click like, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories.